Okay, so what do we want to talk about in our next, we got two presentations for the next hour. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing on early season high tunnel green bean production. And then we're going to have Randy M. talk. He's from Nevada. He's going to talk a little bit about some of the work that's going on bringing high tunnels into rural communities. And he's been doing a lot of work in Nevada on that, and we've been working with him as well. So as you can imagine, we're trying to look at diversification as well. So not only do we know that we want to grow lettuce and spinach and tomatoes and other crops like that, but we need to be thinking about how can we diversify our product line. And that product line is going to include things like snap beans or green beans. So essentially, as we think about a larger scale production system where we have multiple tunnels, we need to begin to think about that diversification. And so we want to ask ourselves, why beans into it? We've grown a lot of different crops over the years, squash, tomatoes at the same time. In the fall of the year, we've gone to spinach, lettuce, Chinese cabbage. There's a lot of those leafy greens that we can get into. But we maybe want to look at different crops to figure those into the system as well. Finally, what we need to also do, Brittany, could you get those lights? The bottom one there, just... Okay. Yeah, you're good. You're good. So, beans. Why beans? Essentially what we're trying to do is capture a market when there's really little supply available. As you think about bean production in many places, that generally will start around early July, and if we can start getting beans in the June market, that just gives us a jump on somebody else. There's been a lot of requests for this kind of information in some of our local markets. People are saying, well, what else can I grow in these tunnels that can help me diversify, create some rotational things that might be necessary, because you can imagine if we're growing the same crop, like strawberries after strawberries after strawberries, there are potential for buildup of pests and disease that create issues that make the tunnel less viable. So we've got direct markets that we're maybe supplying, and our customers are coming along and saying, is this all the only thing you have? And certainly there's a price premium there. And lots of times our outdoor stuff can start really late. And this past year was a good example of that. Beans really didn't start kicking into the local market until late July, and we were trying to figure out ways to get something a little bit earlier. Now, over the course of the day, you saw a lot of examples of a temperature profile for the particular crop. On this axis, we have the growth requirement for that particular plant. So that tells us how fast the plant is growing. On the bottom axis, we have how that plant responds in terms of injury when it's very cold down on this end, all the way to injury when it's very hot on the other end. And for bean, we see that growth really doesn't start until we get temperatures of around 50. The optimal range for beans is somewhere between 70 and 80 degrees, with the maximum growth usually occurring around 74 degrees. And then once we get temperatures up above 90 degrees, we see that those plants are getting injured by those very high temperatures. And primarily the injury at 90 degrees impacts the flower. And I'm interested in the flower because the flower then produces the bean pod that will be able to be sold. So ultimately, what can we do at these high temperatures? Certainly we can try to ventilate more, but that may not always work. Shading really can help some in dropping that temperature back in. But ideally, when we're thinking about these tunnels, it's probably primarily ventilation that we're looking at for our early season crops. So our temperature ranges kind of are a little bit different depending on what's going on. Germination is really pretty critical. because with bean we will direct seed this. We'll plant seeds. We're not going to transplant these. It would be uneconomical for us to do that. And the minimum temperature, soil temperature for germination is around 60 degrees. The optimum temperature is 80, and then it will germinate quite well up and even up into the mid-90s. And then as we look at the requirement for vegetative growth, what we tend to see is that just to grow leaf tissue, we have temperatures that can go up to 95. The plant will grow quite nicely, but overall it does better at slightly cooler temperature. And then as we get into the flowering period and the pod sizing period, our maximum temperature actually drops. And so we really got to be careful that we don't exceed that 90-degree temperature range, because then we get too many flowers that abort. Or we get pods that size inadequately, where some seeds within the pod don't fill, and then you get odd-shaped pods or curved pods that may not meet your market requirements. So when we're dealing with high tunnels, the questions then come, can we figure out some appropriate planting dates? How early can we go? What information do we have available to us on varietal selections that can go into the tunnel and meet some of our requirements? What kind of secondary covers should we be putting on? Should they be floating row covers or the remade type material? Should we be putting on plastic covers? And then ultimately, what goes on in the tunnel is how many plants emerge. How many plants do we get out of the soil and out of the ground? Because that gives us our plant population, and the yield is based on plant population. So as we look at this table, it deals with climatic information for a range of cities throughout Utah. And the key thing that we want to look at are the timings of when the last spring freeze occurs, and particularly what that range is. So we've got what the earliest spring freeze on record is, what the latest spring freeze on record occurs, and then kind of where the average falls out. And you can see if we're going to start up in Bear Lake and work our way down the state through different areas, we're going to kind of try and figure those things out. And I just circled a region where, as if we were in Moab, our earliest spring freeze, the last one that occurs would be in early March. Normally it occurs right around the middle of April, and the latest potential spring freeze on record can be as late as the 18th of May. So we've got this huge variation that occurs. If we look at along the Wasatch Front, in the Ogden region, it's the 18th of April for the earliest day, somewhere mid-May for the average time period, and as late as the middle of June. So last year we had frosts that occurred in early June here. And so we need to take that into account, and that can help us start to plan what we're going to do for our high tunnel for a lot of different crops. Look at Park City. It's in June. It can freeze as well as that, and then it goes from there. And so if you're going to be growing some of these crops up in these high mountain valleys where we have high elevations, very short production periods, we need to know this kind of information. And you can get all of that information from the Utah Climate Center's website at climate.usu.edu. If you go there, you can request specific data for your city. And you can use that then to help you decide when you're going to plant. And so we use these for a wide range of crops. For warm weather crops like beans, tomatoes, peppers, we tell ourselves our earliest last spring freeze, when does that occur? And then we try to go earlier than that. So if we look at the Logan date, that occurs right around the end of April. And so we're saying that we should be able to plant at least 1 month earlier than that in the high tunnel and be reasonably safe. And if we do some additional things like add a little bit of heat to the soil, put secondary covers over top of the plants, We may be able to go even a little bit earlier than that. So our target for tomatoes is somewhere around the last week of March, and we do the same type of thing for pepper, and now we're saying that that's probably the target that we want to have for beans. But to be safe in our trial, we went a little bit later than that, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, what are some of the potential varieties that are out there and available for you? Well, I don't know that I want to make a recommendation for a variety for you because you have your particular market needs and you know a lot more about what your customers like. The key thing that you want to look for is how many days on average does it take to get that crop to mature from planting. Now, it's going to take longer in our tunnel. We know that. But we have some of these very early types that produce about in 50 days. And that 50 days is assuming that we're at the ideal temperature, right? Our ideal temperature range for beans is in that 70 to 75 degree range that we're looking at. That's about what it should take. So we would expect maybe in a tunnel where our day temperatures are warm and our night temperatures are cool that this time frame is going to get a little bit longer. So we've got a lot of different green types. We've got some different wax types beans. Your market may want some of those. And you may, in some situations, say, I want to grow a bean that's going to produce pods over a much, much longer time window to try and increase my productivity so that I can just continually harvest as those plants are producing. So I may want to go to a pole bean type. We have not tried that yet. That may be something that we do in the future. But we may run into some issues where we have excessive temperatures that cause flower drop that then reduces our productivity. And we know we can grow plenty of beans outside. So why not use our tunnel to get us early beans and then just move into outdoor production that continues to supply our particular market? We're trying to strategize along those lines. And these are some selections, potential inputs that could be there. There are literally hundreds of bean varieties, and for me to test them all is pretty much impossible. So it kind of comes back to you knowing what your customer wants and working from there. So the methodology that we were using in order to begin to assess this is we selected this variety called Provider. It's a relatively short maturing type. It produces a reasonably nice straight pod that's about 6 inches long. It tends to be very straight in its characteristics. And then we, in the tunnels, either planted those directly in the soil and left them uncovered, or we covered them with our Agribond or our Remay type material. And we selected a bunch of planting dates from early April through toward mid to late April, which would be about the time that our earliest, this last planting date was designed around our earliest last frost date that we might expect for that area, without getting into the late March period where we know our soil temperatures may be too cold for things. And then essentially we planted small areas in tunnels with a known number of seeds so that we could evaluate what effect the conditions in the tunnel had on getting the plant to establish itself. So we looked at the emergence of those crops, and ideally we're looking for a nice uniform stand of plants that are growing at the same rate so that we can get sufficient plants for us to harvest and get high levels of productivity. So we have our 3 planting dates, and then we looked at whether the plant was covered, uncovered, or covered, and we looked at the percent of the plants that came up from seeding 100 seeds. So essentially, with the no covers, when we planted very early in April, when soils are still cold, even in our tunnels, we found that we only got 36% plant stands. So only 36 plants came from every 100 seeds that we planted. But where we covered it with Remay, we even got less. And the reason for that is right at the ground level, the Remay reflects too much energy off of the soil surface, and our soil temperatures are not nearly as high underneath there. And as a result of that, as we're trying to get these plants to come up through the soil, we don't generate enough heat into the system. As we move into the middle of April, we see that our numbers in about a 1 week time frame really start to ramp up, and we're getting really good plant emergence with no covers, slightly less with covers, and then as we move later in the month, we're even doing better than that, and as a result, we're getting ideal stands. Question?
You're not pulling back the covers during the most intense.
No, we're not.
Okay.
No, we're not. Then if you look at how long it takes for those plants to come up, this measure here, the T50 value, determines the time that it takes for half of the plants to emerge. So of these 36, when did the 18th one emerge? That's essentially what you're asking. And for this early April, it could take upwards of about 30 days. The temperatures are just really cold in there early in the season, and in this past year particularly they were very cold because of our spring conditions. As we moved into the middle month, it took about roughly 20 days for the first 50 or first half of them to come out of the ground, and as we moved later in the month, it took about 16 or 17 days roughly for them to come out of the ground. So as we're getting warmer in the springtime, they're coming up faster, and as a result of that, in effect, all we tended to do in our experiment is bunch all of the emergence up together, so we maybe missed out on some of our earliness. Why was that going on? Well, it all had to do with soil temperature. Remember, our optimum soil temperature is about 80 degrees. And you can see that for ones that had no cover, at nighttime, our temperature was lower than our ones that were covered. But during the day, because the soil is dark, it heats up more quickly. We actually had higher temperatures underneath in the bare soil because the darker color was absorbing more radiation. And where we had the fleecy white cover, it was reflecting more of that heat away from the plants, and the temperature was slightly lower, and we were kind of approaching this optimum temperature of 80 that we were trying to achieve. And as a result, this is on that first week, April 6 to 12, when we were planting. As a result of that, this accumulated pattern over many days resulted in lower emergences and a slower emergence time. So it was just delaying things for us too much. As we went out toward late April, when our planting date was, for the week that occurred after that, notice that our day temperatures are higher. We're not getting quite as much heat in the house, but we aren't going as low at night, and the two are overlapping each other much more closely, and as a result of that, what we see is a higher percent emergence and a shorter time that it takes for those plants to come up and get out of the ground. So effectively what we need to do, and why I kind of should have done this before, was I should have probably used plastic laying on the soil that allowed the radiation to go through that, heat up that soil more quickly, and from that we would get a better emergence, which would change these two numbers here. This one would be a lot bigger, and this one would be a lot smaller, which tells us that. And so this spring, when we do that, that's going to be our goal. Our goal is going to be to switch this planting date a little bit earlier, use some plastic covers over top of them, capture more radiation as we saw in all of those examples this morning, and therefore generate a better stand that will give us earlier production, because it's all about getting enough beans for us. So what did we find when we looked at the harvest of these particular crops? We're interested in earliness, because that's important. We're interested in the total amount of production, and we're starting to collect some economics data. And you can see here's our plantings, at this time period, which would be about early July, or where we're picking and things like that. You can see we just got a mass of beans in that house that we're going to try and get. Our first harvest for all of the treatments was on June 24. So outdoors, we didn't start seeing any beans coming into the local market until about July 24. So we're much earlier than those. So that's good for the type of season that we had last year. We had nice plants growing in there. You can see lots of bean pods at various stages of development. And then we went through and then we harvested beans twice a week. We would harvest on Tuesdays and Fridays effectively to look at production. If we look at this early production period, which will be from June 24 to July 5, where we had covers over top of our plants, the remay material, you can see that the productivity was relatively low, and if we ramp up those numbers and look at the productivity and say, how many pounds of beans did I produce in a tunnel that is 96 feet long by 14 feet wide for the side that we had, you can see our early production where we had covered plants was somewhere between 130 and 250 pounds depending on the planting date. If we left them uncovered, we actually did slightly better when we were early than for our earliest date, just simply because those plants were growing better and we had more plants there. Remember that our uncovered ones had 36 plants out of 100 and our covered ones only had 19 plants out of 100. So that difference in productivity is reflected in these yield values. As we got into April, you saw that that seems to be where we're getting the best early yields, and then when we get into late April, where we're looking at this, we're finding that our yields are slightly lower, and a lot of that has to do with that, yes, we started picking on the 24th for these late April planting dates, but we just didn't pick a lot because they were still a little bit behind. And so if we look at that early production, essentially the blue ones are anything that was covered with remay, so you can kind of see the variation that's occurring there for the different planting dates. And essentially what we're trying to achieve is, productivity that might be in this about 0.15 pounds per square feet, which would be about 150 pounds for the tunnel. If we look at total production, which includes everything up until about the middle of July, from late June to middle of July, you can see that we got fairly high levels of productivity, over 500 pounds in some of these things for a full-size tunnel that we would be growing. And that, once again, anything that was covered early is lower yield, and it's low because we have less plants. As we get later in the middle part of April, we did really well with that. Essentially all of these are about the same in terms of their level of productivity. So essentially what we see is these uncovered ones are doing much better in all of the different planting dates, and a lot of that has to do with we were just not getting enough plants emerging, and so this coming year we are going to go to using plastic instead of the remay material. Now, if you want to look at this distribution over time, this graph shows the marketable yield that would be harvested over the full harvest period from late June until the middle of July. The blue line is for our earliest planting date, and you can see it's early. Doesn't yield quite as much because we have few plants in place there. When we get better plant stands, the green line, the middle of April, is earlier. We're getting a lot more early yield on that than the later April planting date, and so we can kind of use that to help time to make sure that we're getting enough distribution of productivity to meet our market requirements. And as a result of that, we can actually start to figure out or start to work toward figuring out when we should plant to get a good distribution of yield over a long period of time to meet that early market requirement. We went through and did a little bit of a sensitivity analysis on economics. We figured that some of the early bean prices can run somewhere between $2 and $2.50 a pound. People that had a little bit of early beans were getting good prices for them. We said, well, we're producing about 550 pounds in one of these tunnels. When we look at our labor costs, we have about $500 in labor cost, and the bulk of that labor cost is harvest, of course, because you've got to go through and hand pick all of these, and that's where. So we got about $500 in labor costs. We've got about a little over $100 supply costs because we don't have too much inputs into the system. We're taking a little bit of depreciation on our high tunnel. We have to do that because I'm offsetting it against other crops that might be more valuable. So we effectively would say that we could make a little over $400 from a tunnel of early beans. And this was based on that April 13 planting date, and our annual operating depreciation costs are based on if I only grow beans in that tunnel. Now those numbers will change if I had some early spinach before the beans were planted, and it would change if I maybe grew some late squash or transplanted back into, let's say, strawberries after the beans were done, because remember our strawberry planting date is somewhere in late August. I'll have time to clean my house up, get my beds ready, and get ready for those types of crops, and then grow that next one. So some of these depreciation costs are going to change a little bit. And tomorrow, when we have the economics section on high tunnels tomorrow afternoon, Dr. Ward and I will talk at length about how we're going to put these strategies together to create more opportunity for production. So in summary, early planting dates did not generate as much earliness as we want, mostly because we had poor plant stands. The mid-planting, April planting dates provided adequate levels for acceptable stands and for acceptable levels of productivity. Some of the late planted ones, what we started seeing was a little bit more flower drop or just fewer flowers on the plants because it was getting hotter inside the tunnels. The floating row covers are not advised due to this inadequate early warming. And as a result of that, we're going to go back and use plastic sheets laid over the rows to help us get the emergence that we need. I'll come back to your question in a second there. And then this is our last slide, effectively looking at more economic data. And then what we really want to try and target in at is, can I get my early production so that it's coming earlier? I want it in about early June rather than late June. And in normal years, I suspect that would happen. And certainly, that would, if we can get them in late June, this will allow us to actually plant in early July again for our fall tomatoes. So we can double crop that site and really utilize that space a little bit more efficiently. So these are going to be the opportunities, trying to mix tomatoes and peppers and beans and spinach and strawberries into a larger economic engine that will allow us to have the diversification to give us some of the things that we need for our markets.